He has an impressive collection of degrees from University of Michigan, from Stanford, from SMU, and in his copious spare time, as well as running Mentor, also chairs the EDAC Consortium. So with that, over to you, Wally. Thanks.
So thank you, Simon. ARM provides something to all of us as a basis for the products that we create. And it allows us to differentiate in ways that we have special skills to do things better than anyone else. We all have a goal to differentiate our products. And we sort of know what a differentiated product is and what a commodity is. After all, commodities are sold largely on undifferentiated price competition. Who makes the cheaper product? And when we differentiate, we have some other feature, power or ease of use or styling or other capability. The problem is, how do you measure this, and can you quantify differentiation? Well, on the left side, or right side, I'm sorry, we have a $15 cell phone. You can use it to make phone calls. You can even send text messages. It's a phone. And on the other side, we have an iPhone 4, 50 times the price. It still makes phone calls. It sends text messages. Is it really worth 50 times as much? Well, apparently people think so because they pay that. So I thought I would take Apple as an example of differentiation and walk back through a little history. If you plot gross profit margin percent, so that's shown in green here, and you plot market share, and look back into the history of the personal computer industry, we had early on the introduction of the Apple I, which achieved about a third of the total market and generated quite good gross profit margin, around 50%. And not long after, the release of the Macintosh, the release of the IBM PC sort of cut into that penetration. In fact, dramatically reduced it from about a third down to something in the 10 to 15% range. But the Mac caused some recovery, and the market share held, and the gross margins improved over time. But in roughly the early 1990s, an experiment was conducted. The Mac Classic was introduced, and it was priced to compete with the IBM-compatible personal computers. And it had an interesting effect. It had very little effect on market penetration, but it had a disastrous effect on gross profit margin. And that was amplified by the introduction of Microsoft Windows, where the perceived differentiation was reduced even further for the Mac compared to the PC. And ultimately, the gross profit margins continued to fall, the market penetration fell, and until the introduction of the iPod was down in a negative range, and the penetration of the Mac about 2% of the total market. All that changed with the iPod and then the iPhone. So today, if you buy an equivalently equipped Mac versus a PC, same amount of memory, disk space, so on, you pay about twice the price. Real differentiation if you can sell a product for 2 times what the commodity version sells for. Well, I contend that the best measure of differentiation is gross profit margin percent. The reason being, there are not that many tricks you can play with reporting cost of goods sold versus revenue. There are fewer footnotes, and you can basically calculate it for all sorts of different products, a comparison from company to company, product to product. And although it's not good for software products because we're not allowed to allocate cost to pure software products, if the software is embedded, it adds to the differentiation of the product. So let's take a look at the competitors for Apple during this period, and you can see they too had problems with their gross profit margin percent or their perceived differentiation. We had Compaq and Dell all seeing their gross profit margins cut in half here. And then ultimately, the PC market commoditized. And in a commoditized market, we see about a 10% gross profit margin. That's what ASUS and Acer and others run today. And that's what you get if you allow it to commoditize. Well, it's sort of an analogous situation to look today at that whole history and think about the IBM PC, big volume, lowest price, commoditized, versus the Mac, highly differentiated, and ultimately a higher price, very much like what's going on today as we look at the iPhone in its very high price, specialized, highly differentiated form, versus Android phones, which actually constitute greater volume, but in fact have greater price competition and therefore have a lot of the same similarities. And if we remember those days of the IBM PC or compatible PCs, we remember there were over 100 casualties who produced IBM compatible PCs who went out of the market, a portion of them shown here, who either withdrew or simply went out of business. Well, why won't the same thing happen with smartphones? After all, we saw this big decline in gross profit margin. Today, gross profit margins for smartphones are pretty good. But what about the future? Well, in order to sustain differentiation, there are a number of steps that can be undertaken, and the cell phone is a really interesting one to look at. After all, most of us spend our time worrying about product differentiation. What features do we have? How does our product perform versus competition, and so on. In the Apple case, styling and all sorts of ease-of-use features really made it a highly differentiated product. MP3 players had been around a long time. People used them. They just hadn't become popular until the iPod. But in fact, the thing that sustains differentiation is the infrastructure you put around a product. In the case of Apple, it's things like iTunes, like the Apple stores and the Genius bars and other things that create an infrastructure that makes it hard for you to switch if you're hooked on using Apple products. And ultimately, the goal for all of us is if you really want to build defensible barriers of differentiation, you build an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is distinguished from an infrastructure in that you pay for the infrastructure, but third parties pay for the ecosystem. So it includes the things like all the apps that are available to run on the iPhone or now on the Android phones. It's the connectors in cars and hotels. It's the accessories. It's all those things that now make it even more difficult to move to a different product. Well, in the Apple case, it was really a remarkable one because today, even though PCs are only a fourth of the total revenue, this whole infrastructure has built up around it. The iTunes that were introduced for the iPod also complement the other products, the iPhone and the PCs and now the iPad. And now we have apps, we have iBooks, we have other things that tie the ecosystem together. Pretty remarkable set of differentiated defensible boundaries. But after all, that's Apple. We're not Apple. We have to worry about our businesses. What about the semiconductor business? Well, this happens and actually happens more often than you would think. After all, the 1978, the x86 microprocessors continue to be extended. They have differentiated features. They have patents protecting them, even some differentiation in manufacturing process and design. But it's really the infrastructure, the number of people who've used x86s, and particularly the ecosystem of Microsoft software and then all the third-party apps that sit on top of it. Well, so what about commoditized products? Is it possible to de-commoditize a product once it's gone down that path? The answer? Well, yes, absolutely. Consider, for example, a glass of water, a roughly 2 10,000ths of 1 cent. We've all bought many of these in our lifetimes. We've consumed them. And yet, in recent years, people have come and found a way to sell us a glass of water for 75 cents. Quite a difference, I might add. The total available market for bottled water is forecast to be $65 billion in 2012. That's 13 times as large as the total electronic design automation software market. And no algorithms, no engineers, and stable design rules. A wonderful business. Well, what about a high-tech product? How about one that we're all familiar with that has gone through the commoditization? Do those ever reverse themselves? And in fact, they too do. I've taken an example out of my personal history of being engineering manager for the Consumer Products Division of Texas Instruments. And at the time I started working in that group, not long before the 4-function calculators had been introduced, they had nearly 500 components. They sold for nearly $500. And we had a goal, like putting a man on the moon. This one was a single chip calculator. Get the 500 components down to one component. By 1974, it was down to 50, and by 1976, it was done. The 4-function calculator was a single chip. Shortly thereafter, the scientific calculator. And of course, you can imagine just how much money Texas Instruments made for these great innovations. Not very much. They in fact found it to be a pretty bad business, made very modest amounts of money during this time frame. So it's quite interesting that they did what many companies do. That is, they found that it was cheaper to OEM products and simply put a Texas Instruments label on them. These are Toshiba calculators. You can see the similarity, but this one has a Texas Instruments on it, and they could get a few points more margin, and that way lose less money than by building them themselves. Well, that's an okay business, I guess, but the company really sort of lost interest in this and sort of left the people alone to innovate. And when you leave employees in a company alone to innovate and don't pay too much attention to them, after all, the calculator division was really not saleable because the only value it had was its name, and you really can't sell your name, so they just let them continue to run. And today, they now sell calculators like this for $150 for the graphing calculator, the TI-89. For somewhere under $5, they even sell the low-end calculators. And having raised 2 daughters through grade school, junior high school, and college, I have personally purchased 8 of these, knowing full well that it cost TI less than $20 a piece to make them. And yet my daughters continue to lose them, break them, lend them to friends. They need a different one for a different course. Really a remarkable money machine. So how did this all happen? Well, what the innovative employees did was look back at their history and say, where were we really successful? And in fact, the place they were most successful early on was in educational products. The little professor to teach math and Speak and Spell to teach spelling. And so the thought came, why not focus? And here again, while you can't afford to build an infrastructure that covers the whole world, you can afford to build an infrastructure that covers a narrow vertical market. They chose that market. It was education. And then they worked with teachers to figure out what calculators could be used for courses and how could they lock those teachers, those classes, those school boards into a single family of products. They did exactly that. They went out and they paid people to write courseware. They paid teachers to come to conventions and be trained to use the calculators. They gave prizes. They worked with school boards. But they focused on the educational market and, in fact, over time, built this infrastructure that was quite successful. In fact, it went from negligible gross profit margins to, in this decade, somewhere in the 50% range to around the 65% range, at which time TI stopped reporting the data for the calculator division. Now, having been a senior manager at Texas Instruments for 21 years, I'm going to speculate that the reason that they stopped reporting it is because the numbers became embarrassingly good. Far higher than the gross margins they generate building semiconductors, their primary business. So why rub it in everyone's face? Let's hide the numbers. At any rate, today, it's somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion of revenue. Quite a good business, not commoditized at all. Well, enough about calculators and Apple. What about semiconductors, the business we really care about? Gross profit margins were always low in the early days of the semiconductor industry because we could freely copy everyone else. No, all patents were cross-licensed, no copyrights. An alternate source simply copied everybody else's catalog. The greatest period of innovation in history, actually, in technology, because everyone stood on everyone else's shoulders, but there was not a lot of gross profit margin or differentiation. Today, there is a substantial amount of differentiation among products, and what I've done is taken the 7 categories that are reported upon for semiconductor products, listed them here: foundries, discrete, memory, application-specific standard products, analog. This is the microprocessor, microcontroller one, field programmable logic, and so on, and taking companies that had substantial portions of their revenue in each, and I'm going to tell you what the gross profit margins are. But first, a test for those brilliant minds in the audience. Just a guess. What do you suppose consistently over recent history has generated the highest gross profit margin among the semiconductor categories? Analog, great guess. Not right, but great guess. Any others? FPGAs. We have some people who have studied the numbers in the audience, one right there in an orange coat. The answer, indeed, yes. FPGAs, consistently high 60%, almost 70%. I personally would have guessed analog, actually, but in fact, not true. FPGAs. So why FPGAs? Why such a high gross profit margin? Well, of course, there are factors that an FPGA is a little like a combination of design software with hardware. And so you get used to using an architecture and you're reluctant to switch. And there are legal constraints. Altera and Xilinx have lots of patents and are not shy about using them. But actually, the biggest thing is the IP. You verify a block of design on one FPGA, and your next design will probably be a derivative, because why should you re-verify it on a different architecture? Lots of effort required. And in fact, if you look at the gross profit margins, the interesting part about this whole thing is that there's drag through. Even Lattice and Actel, now Microsemi, all have just about the same gross profit margins. It's inherently a high GPM business. Well, at the other extreme, you might guess, is memory. Memory is the ultimate commodity. People actually want pin-compatible memories that operate as identically as possible. They, in fact, demand multi-sourcing. There are limited opportunities for architectural differentiation. Process differentiation is fairly short-lived, pretty hard to attack, and the design differentiation is relatively easy to copy. So if we look at gross profit margins for memory, we see actually the only publicly reported ones for quite a while were Micron, which, though volatile, were in sort of this 20% range. Now we can look at Spansion, Micron, Elpida, Hynix, Infineon, and so on. And we see 0 to 40, but mostly 0 to 20 in the lower end of the differentiation spectrum. Well, what about analog? We mentioned it. Seems like the obvious one because you can differentiate both the process and the design. You've got lots of good moderate volume niches to work with. There's more art than science in terms of design, lots of artistes left in our design community here, and lack of multi-sourcing of functions. And indeed, it's true. Analog has excellent gross profit margins. Even broad-based analog, like analog devices, has traditionally run in the 50 to 60% range, and specialty ones like linear and Maxim in the 70 to 80% range. And in fact, if you look at the product mix of a company and measure the percent of their revenue that comes from analog products on the horizontal axis, and look at their gross profit margin on the vertical axis, you see, although quite a bit of spread, there is definitely a correlation that says the higher the percent of analog, the higher the gross margin of the company, or the improved differentiation. In fact, in the case of National, for example, National used to be a broad-based company. In 1965, they were the fourth largest semiconductor company in the world, and they ran in the 20 to 30% gross profit margin range. Eventually, they focused on analog, and the gross profit margins went to 60%. That's the good side of the story. Of course, the other side is that if you're focusing just on analog, the market is not as big. So by this time, they were no longer in the top 20, and today they are no longer. So it's not always a happy ending. So what about application-specific standard products? Now here you have architectural differentiation, design differentiation. You can have lower power. It's harder to copy. You can have embedded software that differentiates the product. And there are all sorts of infrastructure things, software support. So, in fact, gross profit margins for these kinds of companies run in the 50% range. The Marvells, MediaTeks, Broadcoms, Qualcomm makes extra from their patent royalties, but a good differentiated business. Microprocessors, clearly Intel up here in the 55 to 60% range, good, consistent, protected market. We have AMD and NVIDIA down in the 40% range, still good by semiconductor standards. And then discretes. Not so good, but then again, the cost of capital is low, the cost of R&D is low, so these companies can be quite profitable even though their gross margins are in the 20 to 40% range. And finally, we have the foundries of the world. We have the one represented by Shangyi Chang today that stands up here in the 40 to 45% range, and then we have everybody else down here in the 0 to 20, but still clearly, if you have scale, and if you're large enough, a high or reasonably high gross margin. So, what do you do with all this? How can you maximize differentiation? I don't know where we get these things, but it's okay. So if you look at the 10 companies with the highest gross profit margin last year, you see recurring themes. You see a lot of analog companies. You see linear technology there, for example, analog devices. You see FPGA companies, Altera and Xilinx. You see companies that do differentiated ASSPs like Qualcomm. And you even see some with some process differentiation, although most of the process differentiation is increasingly going to analog companies rather than digital companies. Well, if we look at where the future goes, very likely that the differentiation that we experienced for 20, 25 years in the semiconductor industry in process differentiation will be less and less, and will be more on the analog side, but really most of us, just as we use ARM embedded cores to set the plateau for a level of capability, more and more we use foundries to get the basic process capability. So in the future, more of our differentiation has to come from design, from designing lower power, better architectures, better functionality, getting to market quicker. So in the future, more design, less process. Well, what about on the area of infrastructure? Clearly, the traditional ways, application engineering and reference designs and so on, will continue, but more and more, it's how much proprietary IP you can lock around your architecture or around the embedded software you can build within your proprietary implementation, and so more proprietary IP in the future. And then on the ecosystem side. Now, one way to build a big ecosystem is spend a lot of money, and if you can spend enough, you can actually get other people to spend it too, but that's a way that's not available to most of us. So I've looked around at how else could you intentionally develop an ecosystem and not have it happen by accident, and I've come up with two ways I've seen repeatedly occur. One of them I would call serendipity with good follow-up. So Intel introduces their 16-bit microprocessor at nearly the same time as Motorola and Zilog. Actually, about 6 months sooner, Intel clearly the dog of the three in terms of architecture, but they were there first, and so they managed to be designed into the IBM PC. Now, being diligent people, they realized they were in a gold mine, so they put enormous resources on this, followed up with it, took advantage of the situation. So the good luck of being designed into the right product had to be accompanied by the diligence to take advantage of it, forget about telecom, forget about automotive, just focus. And ARM, in this case, an excellent 32-bit embedded microprocessor designed in by a number of companies. I personally signed the second license, and we put it into an embedded processor for baseband for cell phones. And ARM very quickly realized, as more and more people used it for that low power was going to be very important, that 32-bit embedded processors were going to be key, and they followed, in fact, that momentum and became the premier choice for embedded 32-bit microprocessors, particularly for low-power applications. Well, the other way that I found is sacrifice of proprietary capability. So take, for example, Adobe Acrobat. Now, we had Adobe PostScript and a long period of desktop publishing languages. But clearly, Adobe was coming under attack. They had more and more competitors. It was harder and harder to maintain their position. So what did they do? They decided to give away their product for free. Well, not a logical thing to do, but making Adobe Reader free created a market for the creators of the material that ended up being published. And what about Taiwan Semiconductor? In the early 1990s, I remember visiting Don Brooks, who at the time was president, and his big complaint was that everything that he had to run at Taiwan Semiconductor was designed to be run somewhere else, so he was always tweaking the process and struggling to get yield and so on. And he told me at the time, my goal is to make sure that the products we run are designed to be run at TSMC and let everybody else struggle to tweak their processes and try to make them run. And in fact, they did that. They did the unheard of thing. When design rules were highly proprietary, they essentially published their design rules. They worked with the LSI technology to create the Passport library, which then became a standard, and so now everyone else had to match the process at TSMC, so the first designs were, in fact, optimized for TSMC. The IBM PC, of course, an extreme example of where you create a total ecosystem. Unfortunately, in their case, they gave away absolutely everything with it, so there was nothing residual to profit from. But, of course, I have to offer one that's not much better. The Nucleus operating system that is owned by Mentor Graphics actually is used in over 50% of the cell phones today because it was the only royalty-free embedded RTOS you could get. and people who sell big volumes like royalty-free. So it too gave away an awful lot at the front end, but it created an ecosystem, and the ecosystem builds on itself. So, to summarize, GPM percent, I think it really is the best quantitative measure for differentiation of a manufactured product. The difficulty of switching suppliers is best measured by the level of GPM percent. Differentiation starts at the product level. The infrastructure, that investment by suppliers increases that differentiation, and then, of course, if you're lucky, sustained differentiation can come from third-party investment in the ecosystem. And ecosystems don't have to be beyond your control. There are some things you can do. If you're imaginative, work hard, and have good products, you too can have highly differentiated products, success, and an ecosystem for yourselves. Thank you.